Chinese interlocutors in these forums posit that when Korea is unified, if it's in the future, it will be an independent unification, meaning that Korea decides. What that really means is that the US influence will be very limited. And I think from that in Beijing, the assumption that underlies a lot of Chinese strategy towards the Korean Peninsula is that eventually, China will have sufficient influence over both Seoul and Pyongyang to control the outcome in a way where unification is not destabilizing for them in terms of refugee flows, does not result in a strong US-ROK alliance, and separates the peninsula from Japan. I think that's the Chinese operating assumption. And both Seoul and Washington are guilty of fueling that at various points. I think Washington has been guilty when this administration has agreed to things like the new model of great power relations, or the core interests concept, when Washington agrees to a Chinese proposal that management of US-China relations, avoidance of the Thucydides trap and conflict, requires the US and China to have a bipolar condominium and dialogue to reduce areas of disagreement. And requires, in effect, the US to earn Chinese help on issues like North Korea by being more accommodating of Taiwan and the South China Seas. And I'm not sure if that's what the Obama administration officials thought when they agreed to the new model of great power relations, but that's sure how it was received in Beijing and I think in other parts of Asia. So we've contributed to this conceit at points. And frankly, so has Seoul. The Nomi-Chun administration, not in the administration, but in President No's criticism of Washington, fueled this. And to some extent, Park Geun-hye's government has fueled this until recently by clearly prioritizing China over Japan and going pretty far to try to accommodate China to get help on North Korea. So our mission should be to break China of that assumption, to ruin that assumption. And boy, Park Geun-hye has sure done it with the closing of Kaesong, with that. This will mean a certain amount of tension in Japan, in Korea-China relations, a certain amount of tension in US-China relations. And the reason it's the right way to go, because it will force China to appreciate that the dialectic, the Marxist dialectic they see, inevitably leading to more control of the Korean Peninsula, is wrong, that in fact, US alliances are not on the wrong side of history. US alliances are going to strengthen in Asia. And not only strengthen, but move from bilateral to more collective or trilateral types of arrangements, which is very contrary to China's long-term strategic interests, and therefore will motivate them more to deal with the North Korea problem and not be complacent. I think that's absolutely the right strategy. My concern is that the new government in Seoul may not see it that way, and that although people in the new government in the US will probably see it that way, there will be people who will say, look, climate change is more important than this, or something else is more important than this. It takes a discipline at the top that we're not always very good at. But I agree with you. I think that's the way we got to. Everybody who has a voice in this should keep pushing it.
Larry?
I think Mike's last point was well taken. U.S. priorities with China, I think, rank North Korea probably somewhere in the middle, not at the top or even near the top. And I think that's been a big part of the problem. I've written 2 papers this year proposing that after 10 years of futility in the UN Security Council, it's time for the United States to lay a resolution on the table there calling for all UN member states to cut off oil shipments to North Korea, confront China and to some degree Russia at this point after 10 years with having to make a fundamental decision with regard to their North Korean policies, publicizing our proposal highly to the informed Chinese public, but also offering the Chinese as well as the Russians some incentives to make it more difficult for them to say no to this kind of proposal, or at least create in China a real debate about their North Korean policy. One incentive being an offer to return to six-party talks that China calls a meeting in Beijing if they will agree to cutting off North Korean oil shipments. This sanction, I would argue, is the only sanction that has any potential to bring about North Korean concessions, real concessions on the nuclear missile issue. I want to ask you, Mike, about the Bush administration's deliberations about this. Now, I saw reports when I was at CRS that you all had discussions with the Chinese about the oil issue during those years. And I would like to ask you if you could tell us anything about those discussions and what the Chinese said about the issue of a potential oil cutoff. And also, if you could tell us anything about the estimates that you all, I think, received, probably from the intelligence community, about the impact on North Korea if their oil imports were completely cut off.
Sure. Well, I like your proposal on sanctions. If we were serious about it, I think we should make it very clear that the U.S. is prepared with the ROK and Japan, probably the EU, Canada and others, to go ahead and implement these sanctions with or without the Security Council. The problem with the Security Council is that the Chinese know and the Russians know that on Tuesday afternoon, we need help on North Korea. But on Wednesday and Thursday, we need help in Syria, or climate change or something else. And even, even John Bolton, when he was ambassador to the UN, was trapped by this reality that consensus among the P5 is considered by many to be essential to post-war order. And even John Bolton was hesitant to break with the Russians and Chinese on North Korea if it was going to cost later on Syria. Well, Syria wasn't the issue then, but on other issues. So I would say your proposal is the right proposal, but we should be prepared to make it very clear we're prepared to do this without the Security Council. The Security Council, I think, has been a bit of a trap. And we've accepted watered down and limited sanctions in order to demonstrate that North Korea is isolated and that China's turning against North Korea. And I think we've gotten diminishing returns from that approach. And if we're going to keep the pressure on China, we have to make it clear that they're not going to be able to have a casting vote on our policies in the Security Council. We'll try, and then we'll take the niche proposal, and then we'll make it a coalition of the willing. It will be less effective in terms of stopping oil. The 80% or so, about 80% of North Korea's oil is from China. But I think demonstrating this and that it creates a coalition that China's not in would have more effect than trying to work through the Security Council.
I think we could at least force a much more intense debate within China about China's North Korean policy. I think there is as Dr. Henry talked about, a wide body of critics of North Korea in China.
Yes.
In informed Chinese opinion. I think by making this proposal and highly publicizing it, I think this would put the China, with the incentives to China, and I think there could be several we could offer. I think we could bring about a much more intense debate about in China about its North Korea policy, and that in and of itself would be all to the good.
I think you're right, and it's an area that we've not taken advantage of, and it's social media too. On social media, the Chinese are overwhelmingly anti-North Korea and anti-Kim Jong-un. So there's a split between, a Trump-Sanders-like split between the establishment and the people in North Korea. And in Shenyang and in areas near the North Korean border, they could feel the seismic effect of the nuclear tests. There are active volcanoes that have been written about in social media and local media. It's also well known in that region that the North Koreans' chemical and biological arsenals are largely near the Chinese border. And the consequences for their misuse or mistakes would be felt directly into China. So I think there's something there. In terms of offering the Chinese something, I think it's a very bad idea. You're not saying this, but just I would border it by saying it's a very bad idea to think we can get more behavior out of China and North Korea by offering things on Taiwan or not talking about human rights. So the something would have to be in the North Korea lane.
Those are not
right?
part of it.
Yeah, it would have to be in the North Korea lane, and that may be an area where, frankly, dialogue is somewhat useful to us as a sweetener for China to do these things. I think you're right. On the second question, I'm not really in a position to declassify the briefings I got when I was in the NSC. And I'm not sure what you're referring to with the oil. You're talking about, in 2002-3, when the North Koreans agreed to they didn't want to, when they agreed to come to the three-party talks in Beijing in March 2003, and then the six-party talks. But before the March 2003 talks, it's pretty well established in public record, I think, that the oil transmission stopped for a certain period of time. So, and we certainly talked to the Chinese about what leverage they could bring. My sense of it is the Chinese board of AN are still only willing to use pressure to get North Korea to the table to reduce the level of tension, not to actually change the program. That's the threshold we have to get them over. And the way Joe and you and I have been talking about it has a better chance of getting us there than what we're doing right now.
Thank you. Paul?
Good to see you, Michael. I want to just ask you two or three at the most short questions. Are you comfortable or content with the Corean-Administration's policy called, according to Danny Russell, a three-pronged policy: sanction, that is pressure, deterrent, and conditional dialogue, which Chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Crocker, called on abject failure of U.S. policy on North Korea, in the sense that it has not stopped or slowed down the progress of North Korea's nuclear program. I was rather amazed the Obama administration, which is a Democratic, coming after the Bush administration, to pretty much the same policy direction that you setting before you left, and they pretty much follow the same line. That's the question. And secondly, the latest track 2 or 1.5 track meeting in Kuala Lumpur involving Joe Petrani, Bob Calucci, I think Joe Witt, Leon Siegel, these people with North Korean Vice Minister now, Han Sang-yeol, and others. Because the State Department emphatically denied any condonment or U.S. government involvement in the talk, which we can understand. And he was further asked, Jim Colby was asked whether they will write a report. And apparently there was a speculation that this meeting was held in the anticipation that this new group, it's all private citizens now, were going to write a report to the next administration, whoever comes in as a president. Now, the two-part question, whether this will have any impact in your view, other than what's been discussed so far, and other than the areas of your discussion, admitting that there is some utility of talks between with the North Koreans, in the sense that you can have communication, you can learn more about them rather than through or from the Chinese, and keeping dialogue on the level of lower level or working level of the New York Channel, which came to stop in operation. Other than these areas, do you have any specific recommendation for the next administration that comes in? It is interesting though, Donald Trump, if he's elected, nobody knows what he's going to do, and people are saying all bets will be on. and he contradicted himself several times on what he might do on North Korea. He said he will invite Kim Jong-un to Washington, and then next they're calling him crazy maniac and all that. And then for that matter, Obama even, during the campaign, he said he would meet North Korean leader Kim Jong-il and the Iranian leader. He fulfilled his promise 50% by striking deal with the Iranian on the nuclear deal at the end, but no progress whatsoever on North Korea. Having said all that, I'd like to hear your responses.
I think the administration, well, during the 2008 campaign, I was doing Asia for John McCain, and we kept track, and Barack Obama at least 12 times on the record said he would have unconditional meetings with Kim Jong-il. They came into office, they looked at the negotiating record that had been left from October 2008, which was supposed to end up with the North Koreans providing a protocol for verifying their, not the HEU, that wasn't in it, but their plutonium programs, and North Koreans got sanctions lifted on terrorism and provided nothing. Did a complete bait and switch. And I think there were intellectually honest from people like Jim Steinberg and Kurt Campbell, and the new Director of National Intelligence got briefings from the intel community, from other parts of the administration, from outgoing people, and realized that there was no deal to be had. And so they very quickly, they experimented a little bit, but I think the White House concluded this unconditional engagement with dictators policy could not be universal. That if they were going to make progress, they had to decide which ones had some prospect, and they decided pretty